Hey everybody, we want to talk about price elasticity, also price inelasticity. It's an interesting subject in economics, sales, any type of finance. We want to find out what the relationship is in relation to price and demand. Price is one of the central characters or characteristics of economics. When we talk about supply, demand, sales, interest, motivation, all that somewhat revolves around price. Of course, some products are more involved and interested in price than others. Some products or services you just need to have, no matter what the price is. For the most part on those products, though, there's usually some types of regulations. If you had a product or service that somebody had to have, no matter what the cost is, it can be quite dangerous for you in the long run. Because of that, usually a government will step in and regulate some of the prices. An example is water, sewer, something that a person needs in order to live their life. Prescription drugs is always the easiest one. No matter what the cost is, if you're sick and you need to get well, you'll pay just about anything to get better, especially if it involves one of your families or great friends. Prescription drugs would be something that's inelastic. On the flip side is something that's elastic, which means that you'll buy more of it depending on what the price is. So let's talk about some definitions of elastic and inelastic, offer some examples, and then talk about how that affects economics and how it affects those in the business of selling a product or service. Most of us, in fact, work on selling or buying some type of product or service. Unless you work for the government, and that's really one of the only exclusions, your income, your revenues, dependent on how much money you bring in, how much money you sell. In the home place, much of your standard of living is dependent on how much money you bring into the home. You hope to bring in more money than you spend, and if you have that ratio where you bring in more than you spend, you can save money or invest in something else. So price has a tremendous impact not only in one's professional realm, but personal as well. Obviously, if you're creating a product or service, you'd want a product or service that people would buy no matter what the cost is. That's certainly a game changer for most people. If you could create that product that people are going to buy, whether it's $1, $2, $5, or $10, you're obviously going to continue to raise the price of that product and service and try to determine at what point would demand start to fall. Price and demand definitely have a relationship. And if you can continue to raise your price and it has no impact on demand, then you may continue to raise your price. Maybe at some point it would impact demand. If it's a typical product or service, it certainly would. Probably sooner than later. And remember this key point. If you have a product or service that is impervious to price, in other words, no matter how much you continue to raise that price, people will buy that product, it almost certainly would bring new entrants into the market, which means people would see the impact of your product or service in the market. They would see that people would pay just about anything to buy that product, and they would want to enter that product, if they could, and produce and sell that product or service too. That would, of what we know with supply and demand, start to decrease that price. You would have more people bring in the demand for that product. More demand would necessarily reduce the price. There's very few products that can continue to have an ever-increasing supply and the price would go up just as quickly. Eventually, saturation will occur where there would be too many products or services in the market and the price would necessarily demand. That may cause, by the way, some people to leave the market. Therefore, you're going to have a balance, or what we often call an equilibrium. But here we're talking about elastic and inelastic goods and services. Fascinating subject, of course. The premise is that price does have an impact on demand. But if you have one of those products where no matter what the price is, demand isn't as affected, then you have what's called an inelastic type of product. If the price determines how much demand you have, then you have more of an elastic product. In economics, we use the figure of 1. 1 is, in some ways, kind of a perfect equilibrium. When you start to get below 1 in a negative figure, that means and can be interpreted that the product is more inelastic. When it gets above 1, 1.1, 1.2, that means it becomes more elastic. The greater the change in price, the greater the change in demand. Ideally, you would want a product that's below 1, meaning that you could continue to raise the price and your sales would not be impacted. If you raise your price and sales are impacted, then that is more of an elastic product. Many examples of what we would call an inelastic goods or services. Gas is one, and it's not as inelastic as people would think. There's many people, when the price goes up, can cut back somewhat on gas. And we're talking about vacations or even travel that's not necessary. But it tends to be more inelastic, gasoline, not just because of driving and people have to go to work. They could take the subway or a carpool, and that would reduce some of their exposure to the increasing cost. However, there's things like home heating and others that no matter what the price is, you have to pay it. Especially older individuals that are on fixed income. If, for some reason, the price of oil continues to increase and it gets into the winter months when it's going to be quite expensive to heat your home, those individuals are going to have to heat their home. Otherwise, they're certainly not going to be able to live. We see examples of people eating less because they have to pay more for home petrol, gas, electric. So it is more inelastic. More inelastic. There's others as well. Salt tends to be inelastic. Salt is a fairly inexpensive product. People don't spend a lot for it. So if it went up double and triple, it wouldn't necessarily reduce the demand as much. Salt's a fairly plentiful product. Water's a good example. Diamonds too. You can see the price of diamonds continue to increase, but the demand for diamonds remains quite high. Interestingly, we would see a couple more. Apple iPhones. The cost for the Apple iPhone is significantly higher than the Androids, yet they tend to sell pretty well. They're in some ways impervious to price. One way that they do that is that they've learned that if you had to pay an upfront amount for the phone, it would be quite expensive. So they allow you to proportion the cost of that phone over the life of your contract. For instance, instead of $400 when you buy the phone, it's $20 a month for 3 years, or some figure therein. That allows people to buy the iPhone without necessarily having the upfront cost that may prevent them from doing so. Cigarettes, too, is what's called inelastic. When cigarettes were quite cheap, and they are very cheap to make, when they were quite cheap, people smoked quite a bit. Now, with taxes, cigarettes are very expensive. Yet, there's a multitude of people who still smoke cigarettes, no matter the cost. Certainly, we have the addictive behavior, but that's beyond our scope. But without the addictive nature, people enjoy smoking no matter what the cost is. It's true there's fewer people smoking. Part of that may be because of the health risks that have come to light over the years in relation to cigarettes. So there's some examples of inelastic type of products. There's also examples, of course, of elastic types of products as well. Clothing comes to mind. If clothing's fairly cheap, people will buy quite a bit of it. You typically don't put off the purchase of clothing when there's good sales or something like that. In fact, you might buy more. You have a budget to buy clothes, for instance, at the beginning of the school year for your kids. And if it's cheaper and there's better deals, you may get more clothes. It tends to be fairly inelastic, or fairly elastic, meaning that when you have more money or the price is better, you tend to buy more clothes. For wealthier people, it's almost certainly inelastic. No matter what the cost is of the clothing, they will pay it. Maybe it's because of the ability to wear a certain brand or a certain cut. And if you have the money, it doesn't matter what it costs. In fact, clothing that is more expensive to buy is often not necessarily better clothing. There certainly is a difference, but some of that also goes with the name brand and aspects like that. So we've talked a bit about the price elasticity. There's a price elasticity of demand and a price elasticity of supply. Very similar, but we're concentrating on the concept of what price elasticity is. Hopefully by now, we have a good definition. It's the responsiveness of quantity demanded of a commodity or product to changes in its price. We can talk about independent and dependent variables, sometimes demand, sometimes price. But those factors determine the sale of a product. What we want to ensure, what we hope to ensure, is that we can raise the price as much as we can and not impact demand. At the point that demand is becoming impacted and affected, then we have to reduce the price. And you reduce the price until you have an equilibrium. Is that fair? It's fair between the buyer and the seller, but that often depends on the marketplace. It may be unfair if a seller is making a tremendous profit and the buyer has less choice or less alternatives to buy something else. In fact, there's 4 factors, maybe 5, that impact whether a product is going to be elastic or inelastic. As a consumer, you would want to make a product, or you would want to have a product that is obviously inelastic, elastic, because that means that a change in the price is going to impact the demand. The demand, too, is going to impact the price. The consumer has some hold on what the price of that product is. They can start to refuse to buy that product, and the price would go down. When they refuse to buy, of course, demand goes down. Anytime demand goes down, price is going to go down, too. The product is inelastic. What makes it inelastic? Let's talk about those factors. First is substitutes. If somebody raises their price for their product or service, and you could say, well, that's a little high for me. I'm going to buy a substitute product, or maybe one that's slightly different. In the grocery stores, we have what's called generic products. So if a product becomes too high, whether it's apricots, canned apricots, or even pretzels, bought some pretzels today. If the name brand pretzels are much more expensive than the off-brand pretzels, you may buy them the first time just to see if the taste is the same. And if the taste is close enough and the price is low enough, you switch brands. So the brand is hoping that there's some loyalty to the brand, or the difference in price between their product and the generic product is enough where a customer will choose the more premium product. We know that much of a product's price in the grocery store is based on advertising. Some products can spend up to 50% of their cost just on advertising. As soon as you go down that store to buy that product, for instance, pretzels, right next to the more expensive pretzels, the one that you see advertised on TV, is the off-brand, who have no marketing budget. Their impetus to get you to buy their pretzels is that they're half the price or 40% of the price. They hope that you see the tremendous price difference and say, these pretzels look the same. What's interesting is that many of the off-brand or generic products are actually made by the same company that produces the premium product. They're able to sell their product to other vendors and sell them at a cheaper rate, but they also don't have to market those products. In some way, it's a win-win for both sides. The hope, though, is that it doesn't, the word we use in marketing, cannibalize. People don't start buying the cheaper brand as opposed to the more premium brand. The same thing happened with Gap. Gap felt that they had the mid-market pretty well locked up. What they weren't doing well in, though, was the less pricey market. So they created Old Navy. Old Navy sold cheaper type clothes, not as expensive as the Gap. The more premium brand was Banana Republic. So the Gap owned Banana Republic, which was their high-end, Gap, which is their mid-priced brand, and then they brought in Old Navy as their lower-priced brand. Little did they know that Old Navy would be such a success, it started to cannibalize, take sales away from Gap. What was the end result? Gap wasn't doing so well, but yet Old Navy was. Old Navy sold cheaper clothes. Cheaper clothes have less of a profit margin. Gap was seeing that their profits weren't as high because more of their sales were going to Old Navy, which had thinner margins. There's less of a difference between the sale price and the cost of the product. The prevalence of substitutes, though, will impact elastic or inelastic. If it's the only one, if it's the one and only product in the market, then what you will see is that there will be no substitutes. Therefore, the price is going to be fairly inelastic. Second is necessity versus luxury. If it's a luxury item, then it's going to be more inelastic in some ways. In other words, people will buy a Mercedes no matter the cost. They'll buy Hermes clothes no matter what the cost is. They'll buy that diamond no matter what the cost is. Those individuals have the money. Otherwise, why would you spend, in some cases, $400 for a t-shirt? You do it because you have the money, and no matter what the cost is, you're going to be buying those products. If it's a necessity, though, that becomes inelastic as well. You absolutely need that product. There's nothing that you can do about it. The flip side of the necessity, again, goes back to luxury. There are some people that will not buy a luxury, i.e. more expensive, if they don't have the money. So it depends a product, whether it's elastic or inelastic, on their target market. If their target market is rich people, and it's an expensive product, you tend to be a bit more inelastic. People will pay the extra money because they have so much more extra money. But if it's a product that average people would like to buy, then if the price is low enough, then they buy it. Great example is Ralph Lauren, which is, and in some cases, seen as a more luxury brand. However, you can buy those goods at places like Marshall's and TJ Maxx and Ross Dress for Less. If it's an out-of-season style or a color that they don't use anymore, they'll sell it to the discount retailers. And so you can buy name brand products at much less. Nordstrom, which is a fairly big department store, has what's called Nordstrom Rack. It's very popular. And they sell last year's models and also goods that they purchase too much of and they can't sell. So necessity versus luxury is another example that will determine price elasticity. Third is the share of a customer's budget. If a product takes up a larger percentage of a consumer's budget, then even a small amount may be prohibitive of buying that product. It would be elastic. I want to buy it, but I just don't have the money for it. However, if it's a small amount of a person's budget, you could probably raise the price quite significantly and people still will buy it. It's inelastic. Depends on how much money somebody has. The example I'll use is salt, as we talked about earlier. Salt is a fairly cheap product. Cost is low. If they were to dramatically increase the cost of salt for one reason or another, most people would still buy it. It's still low enough. But if the price of gasoline or petrol went up significantly, then that absolutely would have an impact on a person's willingness to spend the money on gasoline to fund their adventures. They may have to pay it to go to work, but outside of that, they'll think twice about driving to other areas during their off time. Lastly, short run versus long run. Price elasticity of demand is usually lower in the short run. It's lower in the short run, which means people will pay it if it's just a short term. But if it gets to be more long term, it may be something that becomes more elastic. Yeah, I'll pay for it now. And a good example is coffee. Coffee can be both inelastic and elastic depending on the circumstance. If it's a short-term increase in the price of coffee, people may pay it knowing that in 2 weeks or 3 weeks it'll go back down. But if they see a long-term trend where the price is doubling or tripling and it does not look like it's going to fall, then it may become what we would think is more elastic. People may look at substitutes, buying a Keurig machine or some other type of substitute to lower the cost of coffee. Coffee is quite expensive. It's fairly cheap to make, too. What we see is, especially in the morning, more people are making their coffee at home and drinking the coffee on the way to work. Then maybe for a break time or over lunch, they'll actually get a coffee at Starbucks or some of the other firms. It reduces the cost quite significantly, and it saves them time in the morning from going to a Starbucks. So those are the 4 factors that would affect elasticity and inelasticity. There's a percentage in front of you that talks about how you can determine this figure of 1 that I mentioned earlier. Again, if it's above 1, then that product is more elastic. It's more impacted by the price. If it's less than 1, then it's more inelastic. That no matter what the price is, people are going to buy it. It'd be great to have something that's -9. Negative 0.9, that should say. I'll leave you with this thought, though. A product may be inelastic today, but in the near future become elastic. That is the interesting aspect of a market. The price, the demand, the supply rarely holds for long. There's few products in existence that maintain their hold over the customer for an extended period of time. That's because if they do, other products are going to try to go into that market and take away that market share. Instead, you tend to have where they fall back into what we would call the equilibrium. Hope this was a great discussion for you, everybody. Look forward to the continued conversations.